I want to talk about an insidious white person habit that I am guilty of. I know a lot of people are. And it is connected to a bigger thing about Trump and diversity that I want to get to. But let me just start with this. So, and as soon as I mention this, you're going to begin seeing it everywhere. It is the habit of describing someone in a story you're telling using their racial background and it serving no narrative purpose at all. It being a totally pointless racial mention. This black man came out of the office and helped me, or this nice elderly Asian man sat down next to me. And it's the kind of narrative detail that literally serves no purpose, and yet I would just again, you're going to notice it everywhere once I mention this, and I have been guilty of this. There's a sort of benign version of it, which is just sort of like mentioning it for no reason. Oh, she married a black man and he's blah, 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 blah. Like, no, for no reason at all. But then there is the more insidious version. And this is where you use it in the narrative to sort of like counter the presumably white audience's presumably negative stereotypes about that person and their race. He was so nice, or he liked classical music, it turns out, or whatever it is. It's freaking insidious. It's horrific. And it is also, once upon a time, I thought of it as this kind of like benign, relatively benign form of racism that had to do with just white people statistically not encountering many people other than themselves, and therefore being in these kinds of, racial bubbles, and therefore they just don't know better. But I'm now more and more, as I watch DEI and diversity being described as some sort of as a code for the presumption that only white people should be in positions of authority and power and responsibility. I'm starting to realize just how awful and insidious the whole thing is. So I was in a documentary series called Hacking Your Mind. I've mentioned it a few times if you follow me. And it is a show that was basically all about the ancient circuitry that is in our brains that still drives the ship most of the time, but is really evolved to be, for the most part, a kind of survival mechanism, a way of finding food quickly, identifying outsiders quickly, and staying safe. And yet it's in charge of our decision-making in the modern world a huge amount of the time. And I, going into this show, had thought, I'm not biased. I don't have these kinds of cognitive shortcuts. I have conquered my ancient evolutionary programming. I mean, I'm married to someone of a different racial background than I, and, I'm raising multiracial kids, and therefore I'm, beyond it in some way. My dad was a historian of slavery. My mom's a public health nurse. Like, nobody is more advanced around this stuff than me. Well, the conceit of this show was essentially to make me the guinea pig in test after test with all these different experts around bias, and show through my results that everybody is biased. And it worked. I mean, I turned out to be ageist and sexist and had all these cognitive shortcuts I didn't know about. And it totally changed my life. I became somebody who no longer believes in this stuff. I believe anybody that claims to not be racist has no idea what they're talking about. Everyone is racist because that's how we're wired. And the trick in the modern world is to fight it as much as we possibly can, to acknowledge it and fight it. That's how I feel about it. So, and that's how all these experts taught me to feel about it. So one of the big transformative things in my experience of doing this show was talking to a researcher named Jennifer Richardson, who is a Yale psychologist. I actually have to check. I don't know if she's still at Yale, but she had been doing this amazing work looking at the ways in which, if you describe to white people that they are soon no longer going to be in the racial majority, it turns out it has an enormous effect on their political opinions on all sorts of stuff, even stuff that doesn't have to do with race. So in 2014, she released this paper in which she showed that if you essentially tell a group of white voters that they're soon going to no longer be in the racially dominant position in the United States, and you compare their answers about politics to their answers afterwards, it turns out they become more conservative on all kinds of stuff, not just racial and social justice issues, but fiscal stuff, the climate stuff, like weird stuff. And that study came to be known in retrospect as the Trump study, because it showed that when you prime people to worry about their racial position in the world, losing racial dominance specifically, as white people are poised to, then all this kinds of stuff happens. And, and that's what Donald Trump ran on, was this notion that, white people are going to lose their supremacy if we don't do something about it. And it took all these different forms, Mexico, diversity, the rest of it. But now, at the time, that was all, I watched something like Black Lives Matter, which was specifically just trying to say that in a world, in a nation in which, we weren't defining mass shootings in such a way that it really included the endless deaths of Black people. Handgun violence, firearm violence is the #1 killer of children in the United States since 2020, but that's been true for Black children since 2006. Opioid overdoses really only gained national attention once they began to afflict good kids. You still see that phrase used, and that racial rhetoric is horrific. And so for years, Black lives have been discounted. And yet, when a very powerful movement came up, Black Lives Matter, to articulate this problem and try and solve it, it got sort of smashed into BLM, this kind of hateable acronym, and was, pilloried in Fox News, propaganda, right? All of this stuff. And to me, that was all this sort of phase in which people were just trying to sort of escape talking about racial injustice and systemic racism. Now we're in this new world where Donald Trump and his administration and all of the political actors around them are using the term diversity as a slur. They're saying that, they're trying to blame the death of 64 people in the plane crash in Washington, D.C. on that. They're trying to, describe people as diversity hires and all this stuff. And I just think we have to stop allowing, in the same way that I tolerated this, that I've decided I can no longer tolerate people just bringing up people's race in a story for no purpose. I can definitely no longer tolerate just sitting by with this stuff. And so I would urge you, when you hear somebody talk about a diversity hire or DEI or the rest of it, you have to say, are you saying to me that only white people are qualified for that kind of position? Is that what you're saying? And then, when they say, no, what I mean is that obviously the right, the process wasn't gone through. You could say, are you saying that the people that are currently the white people who are at the top of the current national organizations are the most qualified people around? And I'm thinking here, of course, of people like the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who has no qualifications. All of these cabinet positions are filled with people with no qualifications other than being close to the president. So anyway, I just think that we're in this new phase in which diversity has become this slur. And to me, it represents this shift from a world in which we were just kind of like casually treating white people as the main characters and everybody else as sort of extra characters. And this nice Black man came out of the woodwork, or this elderly Asian man sat on the bus, right? This assumption that white people are the main characters of the movie is now taking on this very insidious, weaponized form. And I just think we got to keep shouting it out. Boo the screen if the interviewer doesn't jump in and ask, and challenge the use of the term. Don't let people shorthand it. Let's make it an embarrassment to talk about diversity in the way that it's being talked about right now, because it is truly the most wonderful thing about the United States. I've lived and worked all over the world. Diversity is what is beautiful about the United States. And to have it under attack now for the dumbest political and ideological reasons is totally unacceptable.